Yesterday, a 218-page report was released to the public, crowdfunded by 23,000 ordinary British people who put their own money in because they knew the government never would, led by Rupert Lowe MP and a team of researchers, survivors, whistleblowers and experts who sat through months of testimony that most people in power have spent decades trying to avoid hearing. The report is called the Rape Gang Inquiry Report, and it is the most important document released in Britain in living memory, not because it tells us something we did not know, because it puts on the permanent public record something that the state, the police, the political class, the NHS, social services, schools and councils have spent 70 years pretending they did not know. At least 250,000 young British girls were systematically raped, trafficked, tortured and destroyed by organised gangs operating across 149 local authority areas, close to 40% of every local authority district in the United Kingdom. Not a regional problem, not an isolated scandal, a national operation that ran for decades while every institution responsible for protecting those children chose to look away. Let that number sit for a second. 250,000. That is more than the entire population of a city like Oxford. It is more than the number of British military personnel killed in the Second World War. And that is the minimum. The report is explicit that the true figure is probably higher. Almost 19,000 children were identified as sexual exploitation victims in England in a single year. When you scale that nationally over decades, with documented underreporting built into every stage of the process, 250,000 is a floor, not a ceiling. And this started in 1955, and the British Newspaper Archive shows the first recorded case of Pakistani rape gangs operating in Britain. 4 Bradford-based Pakistanis charged with raping a 15-year-old girl from Middlesbrough. Saturday, 27th August, 1955. That is 71 years ago, before most of the politicians who have spent careers denying this existed were even born. So when people talk about this as if it suddenly emerged as a problem in the 2000s when Rotherham hit the newspapers, that is not what the record shows. The record shows it started small, was identified early, and was allowed to grow for 7 decades into something industrial, because no one with power was willing to do their job, and now the institutions. Because this is the part that is almost harder to process than the crimes themselves. Police forces ignored repeated reports, criminalised victims instead of perpetrators, destroyed evidence, let known rapists walk free on bail. The J report on Rotherham, published in 2014, a decade ago, documented that South Yorkshire Police had known since the late 1990s and done nothing. Officers who tried to investigate were told to stand down. One detective who attempted to bring cases forward was subjected to a disciplinary investigation herself. Social services place children in care homes that the report describes as trafficking hubs. Girls in state care, already the most vulnerable children in the country, already failed by their families, were being collected from those care homes by the same men who were abusing them. And social workers closed cases, marked them as no further action, retaliated against whistleblowers who tried to flag what was happening. The NHS recorded it all: genital injuries, sexually transmitted infections in children as young as 13, rape-caused pregnancies, suicide attempts. The clinical notes exist, the records are there. And the children were discharged back to the communities where their abusers were waiting, without a safeguarding referral, without trauma care, without a single phone call to the police. Schools saw older men collecting girls from the school gates, heard disclosures of rape on school premises. Their response was to exclude the girls, not report the men, exclude the children. Taxi licensing authorities renewed permits for the drivers who were the logistical backbone of the entire network. When basic safety measures were proposed, cameras, checks, they backed down in the face of organised protests from the taxi industry. And politicians at every level were briefed. The report is specific on this. Labour-dominated councils and MPs were told what was happening. They denied it later. They prioritised something else. The report names what they prioritised: electoral reliance on Muslim voting blocs, protecting community relations, not losing votes. Now Keir Starmer. Between 2008 and 2013, Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions, the head of the Crown Prosecution Service, the Chief Prosecutor for England and Wales, the person at the top of the system responsible for bringing cases to court. While he held that role, according to the Rupert Lowe report, 13,000 suspected rape gang members and paedophiles were let off with warning letters. 13,000. In 2009, 9 months after Starmer took the job, the CPS declined to prosecute a Rochdale grooming gang case. The reason given was that the victim was unreliable. She was a child, she was being systematically raped, and the CPS decided she was not a credible enough witness to bother prosecuting the men destroying her life. One victim in Greater Manchester was treated by the CPS under Starmer's leadership as a co-conspirator for procuring children on behalf of her abusers. The institution responsible for bringing justice to these girls was categorising a child rape victim as a criminal. The decision not to prosecute Rochdale was eventually reversed in 2011 by Nazir Afzal, who Starmer himself had appointed as chief prosecutor for the North West. 9 men were convicted. Starmer later pointed to that prosecution as evidence that he had taken the issue head-on. He took credit for the prosecution his own office had initially refused to bring. Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp wrote to the inquiry chair in April 2026, saying, "Perhaps Keir Starmer's personal involvement in these failures is why he resisted a proper inquiry for so long." Former detective Maggie Oliver, who exposed the Rochdale scandal and watched it happen from the inside, has demanded Starmer give evidence under oath. Starmer's response to all of this: "Those spreading lies and misinformation are not interested in victims, they are interested in themselves." Those are the words of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in response to demands that he account for 13,000 suspected child rapists receiving warning letters on his watch. Now, the comparison that has been in my head since I read this report, and I'm going to say it directly because I think it is the right one. In the final months of the Second World War, as Soviet forces pushed through Eastern Germany toward Berlin, mass rape was committed on a scale that historians have documented as one of the worst atrocities of the entire conflict. Estimates range from hundreds of thousands to 2 million German women. The accounts from Berlin and Dresden, from survivors, from diaries, from medical records, describe systematic abuse carried out over weeks and months, while the institutions that existed to protect those women either could not or would not function. The accounts of what was done to British girls in Rotherham and Rochdale and Telford and Oxford and 145 other places, passed between men, filmed for blackmail, told they were white trash who deserve punishment, trafficked between cities, some sent to the Middle East, read with the same specific horror as those accounts. The scale is comparable, the institutional failure is comparable, the deliberate suppression of what was happening is comparable. The difference is that what happened in 1945 Berlin was the product of war, of social collapse, of a specific catastrophic moment. What happened in Rotherham happened during peacetime, in a functioning democracy, in towns with police stations and hospitals and schools and councils and MPs. It happened while British soldiers were in Afghanistan and Iraq fighting wars justified in part on the basis of protecting women from exactly this kind of systematic abuse. It happened while the same political class sending those soldiers abroad was actively suppressing evidence of it at home. That is not an accident, that is a choice, made by specific people in specific positions over specific decades. And those people are going to need to answer for it. Now, the dehumanization, because this is the part of the report that I need to say something personal about, and I want to do that properly. The girls in the report, the survivors who gave testimony, the thousands who did not, were not just abused. They were told why they were being abused. They were told they were white trash. They were told they were kufr, a term in Islamic theology for non-believers, for those outside the faith. They were told they deserved what was being done to them because of what they were, not because of anything they had done, because of their race, because of their religion, because they were white British girls who were not Muslim. The report addresses this directly. Perpetrators operated under what it describes as an honour and shame-based clan code that treated non-Muslim girls as property available for sexual use. The report identifies 8 theological dimensions to this: the doctrine of Muslim superiority, the principle of loyalty and disavowal, al-wala wal-bara, which demands enmity toward non-Muslims, the religious justification for sex slavery with non-Muslim captives. An imam from Oxford's own Islamic congregation told the inquiry that fundamentalists within the community believe that because the Prophet married a 9-year-old, what is wrong with a 12-year-old? These girls were not just targeted because they were vulnerable, they were targeted because of what they were. Their vulnerability was the opportunity, their race and their religion were the justification. This is personal to me. My great-grandmother came from Berlin. She survived the Soviet advance into the city at the end of the Second World War. What she and hundreds of thousands of German women experienced in those weeks is documented. by historians, by the women themselves in diaries and accounts that have been preserved. Soviet soldiers committed mass rape across Berlin and Dresden and Eastern Germany on a scale most people have never been told about. Historians estimate somewhere between hundreds of thousands and 2 million German women were assaulted. What stays with me about those accounts is the specific nature of the dehumanization. German women were attacked because they were German. The ideology had defined them as the enemy, as representatives of something that deserved to be punished. Some were made to sing German songs while it happened. The humiliation was targeted at their identity, at what they were. When I read the testimony of the British girls in the Rupert Lowe report, told they were white trash, told they were kuffar who deserved punishment, filmed, trafficked, destroyed, I recognized the same logic. A different ideology. The same act of defining a group of people as subhuman on the basis of who they are and using that definition to justify what is done to them. My great-grandmother survived it. Many of the girls in this report are still living with what was done to them. The report documents girls who attempted suicide, girls whose lives were irrevocably destroyed before they were old enough to drive. Britain in 2026 has to decide what it does with the knowledge that this happened here, in our towns, to our girls during our lifetimes. Now the Afghanistan and Iraq comparison, because in 2001, Britain deployed forces to Afghanistan. The stated justification included the protection of women under the Taliban, the specific argument that military intervention was necessary partly because of how women were being treated in that country. In 2003, British forces participated in the invasion of Iraq. Again, the stated justifications included the liberation of a population from a regime that committed systematic atrocities. British soldiers, young men, mostly working class, mostly from the same kinds of towns where the grooming gangs operated, were fighting and dying in Helmand and Basra. Some of them were from Rotherham. Some of them were from Rochdale, some of them had sisters. While they were in those deserts, the gangs were operating in their towns. In the years of peak deployment to Afghanistan, 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, the grooming networks in Rotherham alone were at full operation. The same years, the same country. A government sending soldiers abroad to protect women from systematic abuse while suppressing evidence of systematic abuse at home. The Casey report, the Jay report, the internal council documents, the police briefings, the political knowledge, all of it existed while those soldiers were being deployed. The people making the decisions to suppress the evidence were the same people or connected to the same people making the decisions to send troops abroad in the name of human rights. That is not irony. That is something much darker than irony. It is a specific, documented hypocrisy on a scale that should end careers and political legacies and reputations. And for most of the people responsible, it has not ended anything. Rupert Lowe stood up and did what the state would not. He raised £790,000 from 23,000 ordinary British people, not government funding, not institutional backing, not the machinery of power, and he built an inquiry that took evidence from survivors, whistleblowers, politicians, experts, and medical professionals. 218 pages, published yesterday. The full witness testimonies are coming next. He has said he will use parliamentary privilege to name perpetrators and those who enabled them. He intends to pursue civil and private legal actions. Sammy Woodhouse, a survivor of the Rotherham gangs turned activist, sat on the inquiry panel every day. She was 11 years old when it started happening to her. She has spent her adult life doing what the state refused to do, making sure it could not be forgotten. The inquiry heard from Susan Hall, leader of the Conservatives in the London Assembly, who described challenging Sadiq Khan about grooming gangs in London and being flooded with calls from women and girls who said they were victims. Khan had read the HM Inspectorate of Constabulary files documenting exactly these patterns in the capital. He read them. He continued publicly denying that grooming gangs existed in London. The Metropolitan Police announced in October 2025 that they were reviewing 9,000 child sexual exploitation cases. The National Crime Agency launched Operation Beaconport to examine thousands more files nationwide after finding human errors, missed lines of inquiry, and cases wrongly dropped. A former Metropolitan Police detective told the inquiry that what happened in London was industrial-scale child prostitution with authorities aware and choosing inaction through a mixture of incompetence, laziness, and corruption. London has the largest Muslim population in Britain. Sadiq Khan relies on significant support from those communities. Widespread acknowledgement of what the inquiry found would have shattered the narrative of community cohesion that his administrations had built, so he denied it. Read the files, denied it anyway. These are the people who need to face accountability, not in the abstract. Specifically, the police officers who ignored reports and criminalised victims need to face criminal investigation. The social workers who placed children in care homes that were trafficking hubs need to face criminal investigation. The NHS administrators who discharged children back to their abusers without safeguarding referrals need to face criminal investigation. The council leaders who were briefed on what was happening and chose to protect community relations instead need to face criminal investigation. The CPS prosecutors who treated child rape victims as co-conspirators need to face criminal investigation. And the politicians. Specifically, the Labour councillors in Rotherham who tipped off perpetrators, who dismissed victims as making lifestyle choices, the MPs who were briefed and denied it, the ministers who suppressed ethnicity data to protect voting blocs, Sadiq Khan who read the files and denied it publicly, and Keir Starmer, who was Director of Public Prosecutions while 13,000 suspected rape gang members and paedophiles were let off with warning letters, who declined to prosecute the Rochdale gang in 2009 because the child victim was deemed unreliable, who later claimed credit for the prosecution his office had refused to bring, who resisted a proper inquiry for years, who, when asked about it, said, "Those who question him are not interested in victims. We had Nuremberg." After the Second World War, the international community established that individuals who participated in systematic crimes against a civilian population, who enabled them, who ordered them, who looked away while they happened, bore personal criminal accountability, not just the people who committed the acts, the institutional infrastructure that enabled them. Britain needs the same reckoning, not a tribunal in The Hague, a full criminal accountability process right here. The people who sat in those council offices and police stations and government departments while this was happening and made the specific choices that allowed it to continue. They need to be in a dock, named, charged, judged, not managed into retirement, not quietly moved sideways, charged. That is not political. That is what accountability looks like when something of this scale happens, when a state fails 250,000 of its children over 7 decades. The minimum response is the full force of the criminal law applied to the people who made it possible. The report is 218 pages long. It is publicly available. Rupert Lowe published it yesterday and has promised the full witness testimonies will follow. He has promised to use parliamentary privilege to name the people responsible. He has promised to pursue private prosecutions. 23,000 ordinary British people funded this because they understood that the state was not going to do it, that the institutions responsible for protecting those children were the same institutions that had failed them and were still, in many cases, run by the same people or their political successors. The Chloe testimony in the report, one of dozens, describes a girl raped repeatedly from the age of 11, passed between men for days at a time. She finally took 2 of her rapists to court in 2022. Neither was found guilty. She is still waiting for justice in 2026, 15 years after the abuse. Still waiting. That is what the current system delivers. Warning letters for 13,000 suspects, and 11-year-olds rapists acquitted in 2022. A Prime Minister saying those who ask questions are not interested in victims. This report changes what is possible to say publicly. It changes what is on the record. The inquiry lacked statutory powers and it could not compel evidence or testimony, but it gathered enough that the truth is now permanent. The people who declined to give evidence did so knowing their refusal would be noted. Rupert Lowe has said he will name them under parliamentary privilege. What the government does next matters. The statutory inquiry that began on April 13, 2026 has legal powers the Lowe inquiry did not. It can compel testimony, require the disclosure of documents. The question is whether the Starmer government, whose leader's own record is documented in the report, will allow that inquiry to examine the people and decisions it needs to examine, or whether the terms of reference will be drawn narrowly enough to avoid the most politically damaging conclusions. The report explicitly flags this. The Labour government produced a national inquiry whose terms of reference deliberately excluded systematic examination of the demographic, cultural and religious drivers. That is from the Lowe report. The government created an inquiry designed not to find the things most important to find. 23,000 British people understood that. They funded an alternative. And the alternative produced 218 pages that the government cannot now pretend do not exist. This is the most important story in British public life right now. It was released yesterday. The government has not commented. Starmer has not commented. Sadiq Khan has not commented. The 250,000 girls who lived through what this report documents are still waiting. They have been waiting since